I appreciated your book, a very short book, Why Empires Fall, which I think in the current moment you can't seem to get moved for commentary about this being the end of Western civilization or the end of America or all of those things. And I suppose that does happen periodically. I mean, over 100 years ago, Oswald Spengler wrote The Decline of the West. And yet in 1999, as you both point out in the opening of your book, Bill Clinton is giving a triumphant speech less than 9 years after the fall of the Soviet Union, saying the possibilities for America and the liberal world order are limitless. And yet you draw comparisons with the penultimate period of the Roman Empire in the West, where the Roman emperor at the time gives a similarly triumphant speech about the opportunities available to the empire, and yet not long after, it dissolves into the various warring states that it becomes. Why do you think that we are witnessing perhaps a rhyming moment in history, today's civilizational decline as it is seen being similar to the Roman empires?
I'll just throw in a little backstory and then answer the question. And the little backstory is this, that John and I first started talking about this a long time before the book appears. The book has had a long gestation period as we thought about how to do it, because it's, we're both agreed on the central idea behind it. And that's the answer to your question. I'll come to that in a minute. But working out how to do it in practical terms took a long time. But the point of putting in the backstory about how long it took us to get there is that we're talking about this in the early to mid 2000s to start with and on, before all the, manure hits the air conditioning as far as the current political discourse is concerned. I'm not claiming huge prescience, it's not shamanistic powers or anything like that. It's just actually there's a structural argument here. And that's the thing that interests John and I, and that we found in common between the two eras that we work on, John working on the modern period and me working on the late Roman and early medieval European context. And the central thesis of the book is that big imperial systems, and you have to think about them as systems with moving parts, change the world in which they operate. And they change the world around them as well as they change themselves. Both things are changing, but people react to the different stimuli that imperial systems offer to the world around them in ways that will eventually make it more difficult for that imperial system to exercise the same level of dominance that it exercised when it first came into existence, when it first began to operate it. And that's our central thesis. In other words, empires create their own at least, well, they don't have to create their own collapse, but they will cause a diminution in the level of regional global power that they exercise because they transform the world around them. And that's what we're trying to argue in the book. That's the big argument, which we think has a lot of legs in it, if I summarize it.
Yeah, I think what I would add to that, John, is that what Peter and I think that looking at very different time periods, and Peter being a scholar of antiquity, of the late Roman Empire and early Middle Ages in Europe, and me being somebody who's sort of my career has been based on this study of the global periphery. I'm a development economist. So we come to this with a similar perspective, which is that we're both, as it were, students of the periphery, and that's we've been since we started out. And I think that what kind of struck us in this conversation we were having in, I think it was around 2005. We've known each other since the early 90s when we were both young academics at Oxford, and this was sort of a random conversation when we were talking about each of the books we'd just written. Peter had just finished, or was just putting the finishing touches on what would be his bestseller on the fall of the Roman Empire. And I'd just written a book on contemporary globalization. And so we're talking about totally different, what are you doing now? What are you writing? And we're talking about totally different topics. What we were struck by is this resemblance that we had looked at the rise, in my case, of the modern West, and Peter is the rise of the Western Empire, and the way in which it transformed the periphery in such a way that ultimately in the later stages, the periphery actually moves from being, the dependent variable, if you will, to being the mover. It is there where the change is beginning, and a change that is largely missed by the scholarship which focuses on the core, if you will. In Peter's case, the legacy, not among historians so much anymore, but among those armchair historians who use Roman history to explain what's happening in the modern world, and a focus on, the sort of the Gibbon interpretation of history, which is internal decay. And Peter says, this is nonsense. This is not what's driving the process. It's what's happening in the periphery. And that was very similar to my argument that I was starting to make then about the changes that are taking place in the world economy. And I won't claim prescience, but I did say in 2000, book I published in, I think it was 2006, that, there will be a financial crisis and recurring financial crises in developed countries because of changes that are happening again in the periphery. So we said, it could be there's an actual, recurring theme in history here that and Peter was the one who really came up with the idea of a life cycle. Could it be that, you sort of, the very thing which makes you rich is ultimately which comes back to undermine you, the exploitation of the periphery, we sort of pursued this idea and came up with essentially a political economic explanation for the life cycle of empires, which is, they grow rich and powerful off the exploitation of the periphery, but in the process of exploitation, inadvertently lead to the development of the periphery until it can ultimately sort of begin to first withstand and ultimately roll back the dominance of the core. And so we just pursued that. And we, as Peter said, we were looking at various ways of writing this book and experimenting with different models. And it was actually my agent who said, when Tim Snyder's book on democracy came out, he said, what about just putting out a short idea book, rather than develop a systematic argument and get into endless arguments with, I'd be constantly arguing with the economists that it wasn't good economics, and Peter would be constantly arguing with the medievalists that, oh, you've missed this and that. That what we're suggesting is an idea that is relevant to anybody looking at the rise and fall of cores and peripheries throughout history, not just this particular one. Although this, when people ask, but why should we even study Rome? I always come back, why are we surprised that in the Western world, Rome exercises such a fixation? Our political, legal, linguistic, traditions all emerge from the fact that in one way or another, all Western countries had some kind of legacy that has shaped us. And we're always mindful. And in that sense, you could take a histoire de la très longue durée view of this and say that, this is a 2,000 or 3,000 year cycle. We don't go that far, but you could. And, the civilizations themselves rise and decline. And of course, what we argue in the book is that decline doesn't necessarily in the modern period. The big difference is it doesn't have to mean fall, but it could with the wrong choices.
When you're talking about the core of an empire or a civilization expanding and being very successful and it impacts the periphery, are some examples of that, for example, America and Britain's development of the petrochemical industry in the Middle East. And now we look at the Middle East as a very powerfully wealthy region of the world, which is dominating many of the capital markets, and perhaps even China with becoming the factory of the world. It has since managed to expand its own capacities and then start to build its own neo-imperial projects like the Belt and Road Initiative, for example.
Yes, that's exactly what we have in mind. So these things start out as imperially driven projects to benefit the imperial core, fundamentally. I mean, both the petrochemical in the Persian Gulf and the investment in China, the shift of manufacturing to China to make cheaper goods, because labor costs were so much cheaper there. They were understood that they were a kind of deal, of course. They would have benefits for the societies in which they were being generated, but the investment from the center is driven by the desire to bring benefit to the center, both in terms of investment income and cheaper goods flowing into the West. But you start that chain reaction, and you end up with China being marginally the second largest economy on the planet. And as a historian, the one thing I would always say is, which sounds very pompous anyway, it's a very simple point. Power is cash. Follow the money, you will see power. So if you change an economic balance, you are changing power structures. If you make China the second largest economy on the planet, you will make China a major global power. You know, there's sometimes a time delay, of course, but it is only a time delay. If China is structurally going to be the second largest economy on the planet for a number of decades, then China will be the second most important global power. Straightforward.